Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector, author of 100 must-read science fiction novels. And today I thought we'd do a career overview of ALFRED BESTER, who these days is a famous figure in science fiction. He was a famous figure in the 1950s, and his star sort of faded when he quit writing science fiction towards the end of the 1950s, and then he returned to the field in the 70s and died in the late 1980s. And from that time onwards, his star's gradually risen again. He's famous again now, but he's primarily known amongst SF readers for his two famous novels. But today we're going to delve a bit deeper and look at the rest of his oeuvre, and I'll talk to you about what to expect if you read it. Bester was born in 1913. He was a New Yorker, but he went to college, I think, in Pennsylvania. And he is sort of best known for two novels in particular, The Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination. But he also wrote a lot of short stories. I personally think his short stories are his best work if you cherry pick the best ones. And my firm belief is that the collection on the right, The Dark Side of the Earth, is his finest collection, and it's one of my favourite books, full stop, which I've read time and time again. There is a review of it on the channel. I'll stick a link in towards the end. And he was one of those people, he wanted to be a Renaissance man, and he became a comics and SF writer around about 1940. And the first time I encountered him, I was probably around about between 8 and 12, probably around about 10 when I read an adaptation of one of his stories in a Marvel comic, a UK reprint, and it was a story called Adam and Eve, which is a fantastic story. And later on, my father, entirely by chance, my father had good taste, bought me the copy of The Dark Side of the Earth that you see there before you, and I never looked back. That was the beginning of a great thing with me and Bester. He wrote comics again, as I say. He worked on Superman, he did some Green Lantern stuff. He actually came up with some Green Lantern stuff which is still sort of in use today. You know, he wrote the oath that the Green Lantern swore. And he did quite a few sort of short stories, and I think he worked in radio as well, or certainly he worked in radio serials, I believe. And that sort of came along sort of early 50s, late 40s. My first step beyond Bester's shorts was his novel, The Demolished Man. And this is my Penguin from the late 70s, and I bought that after being entranced by Dark Side of the Earth, and that was his first SF novel, and it won the first ever Hugo Award for Best Novel back in 1953. He followed that up fairly quickly with this novel in the middle. This is The Rat Race, also known as Who He, and then in 56 came Tiger, which was retitled in the States as The Stars My Destination. Tiger was Bester's preferred title and the title in the UK. There wasn't a UK edition that bore the title The Stars My Destination until the late 80s, which I've always felt is a really dull title, and Tiger is far more exciting. And of course it refers to William Blake, and there is another video on the channel already which looks into the Blakean aspects of Tiger. But if you're not familiar with these books, I'm going to talk you through them, particularly the SF ones. The Demolished Man, blew me away when I first read it. And it came about because Horace Gold, who was the editor of Galaxy magazine, the preeminent SF magazine of the 50s Renaissance in satirical and dystopian SF, said to Bester, how about writing me a novel which we can serialize? And Gold was well known for being involved with the composition process of novels and stories with the writers he worked with, and he would often take big liberties which writers really didn't like a lot of the time, but at the same time he also gave them some great ideas. So he was rather like John W. Campbell at Astounding in that respect, but his focus was quite different and more literary. So The Demolished Man, I say, was won the Hugo in 53. It was published in 1952, I think, and it focuses on a character called Ben Reich, and of course Reich means empire, and he is a kind of volatile, power-hungry guy, and he's the head of a corporation called Monarch. And it's just struck me that's the name of the corporation in the recent sort of Godzilla films, isn't it? And it's a company which has branches all over the various systems that man has colonized in space. And he is pretty much haunted by a recurrent nightmare of a burning, faceless man. And he seeks the help of a telepathic psychiatrist. And the thing is the Freudian slip that is coming through in this dream is recognized. And it comes down to the fact that Ben Reich has a business rival called de Courtney. And really that the only way Reich can escape these dreams is by killing de Courtney. Unfortunately, in this future, the police are espers, ESPers, so they can read minds. And there's a kind of not total recall situation, there's a kind of Minority Report situation. Obviously, Philip K. Dick was writing this sort of thing a little bit later than Bester. So for Reich to sort of commit murder successfully, he has to do it while avoiding these police who can read minds. And how does he get around that? It's very interesting. It's done in a linguistic fashion. So the thing with this book is it's lightning fast. It's very quick moving narrative. It glitters like the facets of a cut diamond. And it's just incredible because Bester is a master plotter and a stylist. He really understood how to use words. And it was just really something really fresh and new and took people aback and was the true beginning of that renaissance of satire which came from outside genre SF into genre SF and enlivened it and made what Robert Silverberg called the 50s into the true golden age of SF. The golden age, of course, was 39 to 46, but the 50s was an even more amazing time. So when I first read this, I was really sort of struck by it, and it's quite a short book. Even by the standards of its day, but it set the sort of standard for things to come, like Paul and Kornbluth and what have you. And it's funny and satirical, and stylistically, it's way ahead. And the thing is that Reich faces, if he's caught by the Esper police, he will be demolished. And it doesn't tell you what demolition is, and you don't find out what demolition is till later in the narrative. And it's not what you think. It's really something. So that's a great one to start with. Even though a lot of people discover Bester through Tiger, The Star's My Destination, my personal feeling is that The Demolished Man is probably a better novel. Tiger is more ambitious and longer, has more in it, but it has less down moments. And I'll come to that later on when I talk about Tiger. So what happened then was that Bester wrote this book, which was originally called Who He. This is I think this is a late 50s, early 60s UK reprint, The Rat Race, which is the title it always had. This is a Panther one. So it's got this wonderful cover. And it's set in the early days of television, or at a game show, upon which a murder is committed. The sort of curtains go back, the cameras come on, and somebody's hanging from the lighting rig. And it's very sort of snappy and witty and hard-boiled and fast-moving. And it has the same sort of linguistic flair that Bester has in his SF. And I've read it twice. What it reminds me of is Mad Men. If you've ever seen the TV series Mad Men, the Madison Avenue era of advertising in the 1950s, where people were wearing Ivy League suits and earning lots of money, and the whole world of consumerism was becoming a big thing in America, and gradually in the rest of Europe. Britain was a bit behind the States that way. We had a lot more issues with cash over here. And it is a fun book. It is a sort of Hitchcockian thriller. You can imagine somebody like Cary Grant being in it, sort of North by Northwest style. And the option was sold for film, and Best got a lot of money for it. And that enabled him and his wife to move to Europe. And he loved Europe. He loved traveling. He loved the finer things in life, great food and great booze. He was a big fan of the booze, old Alfie. And when he was in the UK, he stayed in the UK for some time. And while he was in the UK, the film was never made. He began writing Tiger, The Star's My Destination. And the central character, Gully Foyle, is one of the great anti-heroes of science fiction. And Bester is probably the person, the great precursor of the new wave. What I would say, and I've said for a long time, is that if you've read Bester and you think that he sort of explodes, from the head of Zeus fully formed, then I would say step back and read Henry Kuttner and C.L. Moore, particularly their novel Fury, which is back in print now as a Gollancz masterwork, and its prequel Clash by Night. And you will see where some of the blazing ire of Gullyfoyle, the spirit of vengeance, really comes from. But to talk about Tiger, if you've been living under a rock, I'll tell you a bit more about that as well. And the central character, Gullyfoyle, he's the survivor of a spaceship wreck. And this spaceship is drifting in amongst the stars in hard vacuum. He's the only survivor, and he's really destined to die. And then he sends out a distress signal to another passing starship called Vorga, and the starship ignores his pleas. This awakens something in Foyle, and he goes from being a substandard common man to a kind of Superman, and he learns an ability which nobody else has. And in the future that Tiger takes place, people have learned to teleport or to jaunt, and one thing that nobody has done is jaunt across space. It can't be done. It can only be done on the surface of a planet. And Gullyfoyle goes through a number of adventures. He manages to extricate himself from his doomed position, and he goes in search of Vorga, and he will find out whose orders turned the starship away from rescuing him, and he will extract a revenge. But in the course of this, other things happen inside him, and he becomes aware of something much larger, of something which could possibly liberate mankind itself. And it's very inventive and prodigious in his style, and it is a blazing book, really. Any other writer would probably have taken just one of the ideas and made a whole novel out of them, but Bester just throws them at you one after the other. There is one moment in the book which I think sags, which is when Gullyfoyle gets back to Earth and he is learning how to jaunt. There's a little bit there I think sags, and there's a subplot. Both parts where I think sag a bit involve his relationships with women, and I don't think they quite come off. But nonetheless, you know, this is a landmark work and really, really important. And the two novels, Demolished Man and Tiger, really set the stage for what's going to happen in the 1960s with the new wave, both in the UK and America. So these are really important novels. And for those of you who've read them, it's worth tracking down a copy of The Rat Race, because it's an interesting read. But it's very, very redolent of the 50s. But then you see, with his snappy, finger-popping, hard-boiled style, where the style of the two SF novels comes from as well, and how they're very much part of that time, but they're very livid and alive. Now, alongside the novels from the 1950s, Bester wrote some incredible short stories, as I say, which are really quite something, and which I think are the basis of his genius, really. In the centre here, you'll see the Good Child SF Alternatives hardcover edition of Tiger. I don't have a first. Firsts of both Tiger and the Demolished Man are out there, but they can be up to about £600 or more. They're really expensive books. Would like to have them, but you know, one has to be realistic, and I'm happy with this copy. And very, very plain, as you see, but this is a nice little series. There are only about 6 of these, and I've got most of them. And this one was actually in print until only a few years ago, and I was selling it at work, and some dealers were selling it for a lot more money when it was actually only about 15 quid. So it's worth watching out for that. But the short stories, the best ones, are pretty much collected in these two collections: The Dark Side of the Earth, which was published I think in the mid-60s, most of the stories from the 50s, and Starbursts. And I'm going to talk you through those a bit now. And as I say, Dark Side was my first reading of Bester, and this contains, let's see, 7 stories, and I've read them time and time again. And initially, that's what it is. They were initially in a book called an Alfred Bester Omnibus, which had, I think, also had one of the novels in it. Sidgwick and Jackson published that, and that's quite a scarce book as well. And Time is the Traitor, The Men Who Murdered Muhammad, Out of This World, The Pie Man, The Flowered Thundermug, Will You Wait, and They Don't Make Life Like They Used to. Absolutely fantastic stories, and most of them were published in the 1950s in places like Galaxy and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And they take things like time travel, psychic powers, alternate worlds, post-nuclear apocalypse scenarios, or at least post-apocalyptic scenarios, But in Bester's hands, they're really quite something different. You know, they're all style and they're absolutely fantastic. And the 7 stories in Dark Side of the Earth are sublime. Particularly important is the Pi Man, and that's pi, the mathematical formula. And there will be a video on my other, well, it's in my club room, my members area, where I talk about this at some length and discuss how it influenced the new wave in quite a big way. There's also a story in Darkside, which funnily enough is my least favourite story in it. It's a great story, but it's my least favourite, called The Flowered Thunder Mug. And The Flowered Thunder Mug is a very carnivalesque cavalcade of a tale, which is set in a future after nuclear war, which has been reconstructed. People have risen back up and they've reconstructed society, but they've based it on Hollywood because that's all that was left. So life is perpetually like a Hollywood movie or a TV show, and it's absolutely hellish for a couple of survivors who strangely have been blown forward in time from their own time by the nuclear explosion. Not very scientific, I know. And they're both working as thieves and they're stealing authentic artifacts which have survived for their own personal collections, and it's really good. And there's an echo of this story, it's just struck me now, there's an echo of this in a great story by John Kessel called The Pure Product, which is an amazing time travel story. And it is one of the great time travel stories, but it does have this carnivalesque feeling to it, especially late in the story. And I see that as having the seeds of what Bester did late in his career with his final 3 novels, which are not as acclaimed as the 1950s one. It's also absolutely charming and stylish and witty and very, very funny. And somebody asked me a while ago if you could see one story or SF novel adapted for the big screen, what would it be? And it would be Time is the Traitor, the opening story from this, which I think would make a fantastic adventure narrative. It's very fast-paced and burning and ambitious and lots of ideas in it, and it would make a brilliant film. It really would. It would be a popular Hollywood film as well. It would be a film of high passion and action and adventure, not particularly sophisticated one, though there are feelings in it, but it would just make a fantastic action. It really would. So if you can find this book, pick it up, because it really is quite something. And as I say, there's a review on the channel. Starburst, I'm just going to pick up here, is also really good as well, and this has some cracking stories in it. And looking through it, because I have several copies of Darkside, but I only have one copy of this. It has the very wonderful Disappearing Act. Now, Disappearing Act is one of the great sort of Cold War satires about the way that American thinking was around militarism and Reds under the bed and all sort of stuff. And Disappearing Act is absolutely fantastic. It's the sort of thing that Robert Sheckley could have written had he had more focus. It's probably the sort of thing that Philip K. Dick looked at in those early days of his career and gone, oh wow, you know. And it's the sort of thing that Paul and Kornbluth probably would have given their eye teeth for. To me, it's the best sort of story of its kind. It's really quite something. And looking through the rest of the contents, again, there's such great stuff in here. There are a few stories in here which are regarded as amongst his best. Adam and No Eve is in here, which is a great story, which dates right the way back to early in his career. The Roller Coaster, which is a kind of prelude in some ways to Tiger Tiger. Oddie and Id, which is anthologized an awful lot. And there's also, I think, let's see, the Star Coma, which has been published as a separate book. So if you see the Star Coma as like a print-on-demand thing and think that it's an unfinished work, it's not. It is in Starburst. There's also Fondly Fahrenheit, which is an Android narrative, which generally is regarded by most people as Bester's finest short story. I differ. I don't think Fondly Fahrenheit is anywhere near as good as some of the stories in Dark Side of the Earth, but these are both essential volumes. They're quite uncommon in the pan lozenge. I'd like a really mint copy of Starburst. I've never ever seen one, but watch out for them because they are stellar stuff to pick up if you can. Now, Bester quit SF around 1960 and he wanted to get away from it and do other things. He felt that there was only so much he could do in it. But here are some more short stories. He obviously produced a lot of these. And There was a book which is called something like The Great Short Fiction of ALFRED BESTER, something I can't think exactly what it's called, but it was an omnibus, I should know, but I can't for the life of me think what it was actually called. And it was split into two for UK publication as The Light Fantastic and Starlight Star Bright. So I've actually got those in the wrong order there. So, and as you can see, the two paperbacks are lovely Fontana, particularly like the cover of The Light Fantastic. And this is The Light Fantastic in the Golanx Yellow Jacket. Now the Golanx Yellow Jacket of Starlight Star Bright is really, really, really uncommon. This one isn't too hard to find. But Starlight Star Bright is really, really hard to find. And these have some great stuff in them. They duplicate some of the contents from the two Pan volumes, but you've got to pick them up because they're really important. And they contain the story, let's see, what's the actual, it's a number, 5271009, which he wrote around a magazine cover. Now I think that's the one which is also known as the Star Coma. Fondly Fahrenheit is in here, The Men Who Murdered Muhammad, Disappearing Act. So there's some really great stuff in there. And they were American hardcovers of these, which are really uncommon, particularly in the UK. I do know a dealer who's got a mint pair, but he's not selling at the moment. So that's kind of frustrating, and they're not cheap. And there's just great stuff in here. There's also a couple of non-fiction essays in this one as well, including his brilliant My Love Affair with Science Fiction, which is great. But Bester was critical of SF. And as I say, he moved away from it quite a bit in the 60s. He got a job with a magazine called Holiday, which was a kind of lifestyle and travel magazine, and it enabled him to travel around the world, sampling nice food, meeting famous people and interviewing them, doing all sorts of stuff. And he did that for about 10 years. And for Bester, it was an ideal scenario. And he got away from SF, but he was writing some things. He was writing non-fiction pieces, which I think went into the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And he really sort of had a go at SF quite a lot. He was a book reviewer and he wrote essays. There was one called A Diatribe Against Science Fiction from 1961. And he did another one which was kinda called The Perfect Composite SF Author. And also he was writing TV script screenwriting. He was doing a column for Rogue magazine, and as he was an interview, and then a senior editor for Holiday magazine. Holiday folded about 1970 or changed format. It was sold, and Bester was off the gravy train then, and he found himself in a position where he would have to go back to SF. And at that point, really, we enter the more controversial phase of his career. Now, there was a book that was never published from, we think, the late 50s, early 60s. And this is Tender Loving Rage, and which I think this is the only, there may be print-on-demand paperbacks out there, but this was the Tarcher first edition from 1991, which I bought at the time. And this has affinities with Who He, The Rat Race, but it's more like it's even more Hitchcockian. It's more conventional as a thriller than The Rat Race. It's nonetheless very good, and it's got a very memorable climax on a beach, which I really enjoyed, and I need to reread it because it's been a long time. So as you see, he had other strings to his bow as well, but this wasn't published. I don't know why. We really don't know much about why it wasn't published and whether it was sort of submitted or what have you. But as I say, it didn't appear until 1991. So there you go. It's an interesting thing when this happens, because often, you look at these books and you think, well, they're probably not very good, but this was absolutely fine. But again, very much a book of its time. So with his meal ticket run out, Bester returned to SF in the early 70s, started writing short stories again, and he it's difficult because he got some plaudits, and I think he got shortlisted for a Nebula for his sort of comeback book, which is Extro, known in the USA as The Computer Connection. Fairly terrible title. Would have seemed a little bit more contemporary in the 70s than it does now, where it seems impossibly dated. And really, even though there were some plaudits, it's generally always been regarded as a disappointment, because of course the problem is expectation. What people thought would happen was that Bester would return and he would produce narratives similar to those in The Demolished Man and in Tiger Tiger, because time had moved on and he had moved on as well. And that tendency towards the carnivalesque, towards a parade of different characters and multiple explosions of colour and exoticism, which come at the end of his story, The Flowered Thundermug, they are pretty much writ large in the first two of his final novels, in Extro and Golem to the Power of 100, both of which you see here. And when I read Extro, was I disappointed? I was, but then again, it was my expectation. Looking at it now, I would say it's more enjoyable. And the basic idea of this is that the narrator is a character who has been killed in a very violent way. And he realizes that he's not dead at all, but that he's immortal, that the way to become immortal is to be killed in a particularly violent but unique way. And he develops this obsession with finding people who are geniuses, or people he feels are geniuses, and he's going to kill them in a very violent manner to sort of make them immortal, so that their genius isn't lost. And there is this secret society of immortals, and they're scattered across the solar system, which is by this point densely populated. But one of them is a guy called Sequoia Guess, and he tries to take over a supercomputer complex which controls all the tech on Earth, and that is called Extro. Unfortunately, Sequoia's plan doesn't work, it backfires, and Extro, the AI, takes over Guess. Now, Guess is immortal, he's one of these characters, so it gives the other characters and our protagonist the problem of they have to kill this hybrid immortal AI figure, but of course you cannot kill an immortal. So that's the basic idea behind it. The book is full of all sorts of references which are quite ornate and colourful to other cultures. He mixes in a lot of his reading, obviously, about Native Americans, African culture, and in that way it's rather redolent of, say, what Philip Jose Farmer would do. And the way that it moves away from that kind of sophisticated New York modernist thing into something broader culturally actually works against it in lots of ways. And I think people weren't ready for that. But if you reread them, you realise that there's quite a lot going on, and they're very interesting. And he obviously had a lot of fun with them, but he wasn't what people expected. So they're not classic Bester in that way, but then years had passed. One I enjoyed more than Extro, and there's the Methuen UK paperback of Extro, and it's had various reprints since, on and off. I don't think it's available at the moment. Is Golem to the Power of 100, and you notice I say Golem to the Power of 100 rather than Golem 100, because the way it's written, and that is the title, it's rather like Alien 3 is actually Alien Cubed, and it is important. It is important to the text. And I bought that at, gosh, that was at Fantasy Inn in London many years ago in the early 80s. And this is the first edition, but you can get out this, hard to get them in good nick. And I'm just going to look over it now because it's been some years. I want to reread it. And I did enjoy this one, but again, it has the carnivalesque aspect. And fundamentally, it's set in a megalopolis of the future. And there's a group of women who meet up, and they try and raise the devil to entertain them. But they don't actually manage to do that. Instead, they bring together a coalesced being, which is a manifestation of their collective unconscious. And it starts to sort of go absolutely bonkers. So fundamentally, there's kind of a throwback thing going on here to the creature from the id, summoned by the Krell machine in Forbidden Planet. There's Alfie there. And as I say, it's very carnivalesque again, and very colourful. It ends with a wonderful conceptual breakthrough, which occurs in the very last character of the book, which is really hard to do. I've seen Christopher Priest do that. Keith Roberts does it in The Last Word. A lot of writers do it in The Last Word. I mean, Philip K. Dick could do it in The Last Word, but Bester did it in The Last Character. I think Priest is the only other person I know who's done that, and it's really quite something. So if you come across it, pick it up, because it is really good. Pan published these and did some reissues at some point, so they are worth looking out. But it's a beautiful book as well, but they are full of all this stuff, and you get this kind of thing which Bester was big on typographical experiments. Sure, these are like Rorschach ink blocks, and I do need to reread these. But I wouldn't be put off by the naysayers who say that they're no good. They are good, they're just different. And they do have that sort of hint of the strange mystical things in them which you get, say, in Zelazny, but they are SF. Also, you get flashes of James Blish, the way that the idea that the occult stuff in Golem 100 is actually more to do with science and the unconscious. However, Bester's last novel, The Deceivers, is genuinely a poor book. It was very, very widely remaindered in paperback in the UK. It had the same cover as this. This is the Seven House UK hardcover first, which is quite difficult to find. I have it for completism. I remember being enormously disappointed by it. It has a Native Americans in space focus. It doesn't really come off. I've never ever felt the urge to go back to it, and it's a great shame. But Extro and Golem to the Power of 100, I really, really think everybody should read. Just to sort of finish off, there were some sort of posthumous things, which I'm going to show you now. And around about, I think it might have been the mid-90s or turn of the century, iBooks did a lot of great stuff. They did some Zelazny, they did some Ellison, and they did some Bester, and they did some important Bester. Most important of all was this marvellous retrospective collection, which is called Redemolished. And Redemolished is well worth picking up. It's got all sorts of things in there. There's about 300 pages of short stories, some of which hadn't been previously collected into the other volumes. There's essays, there's bits from Holiday magazine, there's things about Bester, and it's really good. And it's a chunky tome, as you can see. And looking through it now, it's a joy. There's absolutely great stuff in there. And iBooks was part of Simon & Schuster. So some of the things that he wrote for magazine of fantasy and science fiction attacking SF or praising it are in this. Also, Vintage USA did a couple of things as well. They did a really great short story collection, Virtual Unrealities, the short fiction of ALFRED Bester, which has things from right across his career. The problem with that is that it's a biggish book, and in its sort of layout and selection, it's not as focused as Dark Side of the Earth or Starburst are. So things don't always come across in the right context. And I know that Scott Bradfield has the same feeling about me as this. It's best to get the original collections rather than the later retrospectives, because they have a kind of tautness to them where the editorial thinking has been better, where these are more thrown together. And this is an introduction by Silverberg. I'm just going to take a quick look at it now. And yeah, there's, lots of great stuff in here. And it's got more or less all the stories. In fact, I think it has all the stories from Dark Side of the Earth. Let's just do a quick count of them. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I think it's missing one. But it is good, so if you can pick it up, do try and pick up the Dark Side of the Earth instead. However, there's something else which is a bit sad, really, and that's Bester and Zelazny's Psycho Shop, which I have quite strong feelings about. Psycho Shop was put together. There was an unfinished novel that Bester was writing. I think there's about 70 pages of it. And Zelazny was offered the opportunity of completing it. And it really, really doesn't ring true for me. It starts with two guys talking in a bar, and sitting in a bar talking was one of Bester's great loves. He left his estate to his barman. His wife sadly was dead by that point. And it really just doesn't come off. And of course, Zelazny is great in his early days, in the early 60s and into the sort of about the mid 70s. But then he really goes off the boil and he becomes a little bit too fantastic. And there's a sense that the work really, really isn't the same. It loses its sharpness and its astringency. It's still flavoursome, but it is a lot more genre generic, if I can put it that way. It feels like genre fiction rather than literature, and it's not as good. And Psycho Shop falls into that ballpark, sadly. Great pity. I'd like to have seen the text as it was, just presented in a collection without any sort of extension or changes, but it is what it is. I guess it was seen as an opportunity. There's an introduction by Greg Bear, who also sadly, like Zelazny and Bester, is no longer with us, and he says, that Bester and Zelazny are two of the sort of great jazz players in SF. And he goes on then in the introduction to name a load of other people he considers to be jazz musicians, improvisers who have wild ideas in SF. And he names Philip K. Dick, Henry Kuttner, and lots of people I like. So, and I do like jazz as well. So I guess that's the thing. So there's a little career overview of Bester. So there's more to pick up than just the obvious things of The Star's My Destination and The Demolished Man. I would urge you to get out there and find the short stories, particularly Dark Side of the Earth, and have fun with them. And, you know, take your time reading them. And again, with the later novels, particularly Extro and Golem, The Power of 100, it is as much about expectation. So if you go in thinking they're going to be the same sort of thing, they won't be. But let's put this in context of Philip K. Dick. Had Philip K. Dick lived, it seems clear to me that his critical Star Wars Rising, I do have this theory that he would never have become as famous as he is today if, you know, Blade Runner hadn't been made. But I think Dick would have used the money and used the sort of added royalties he got from that to help ease himself further into mainstream writing, because he wanted to write more about his religious beliefs, and he was going to write a book called The Owl in Daylight. So maybe later Dick would have been very different as well, and later Bester is different, you know, to early Bester. And you've got to think back, there were other writers who stepped away from SF in the late 50s, early 60s until the 70s, notably Isaac Asimov, who basically didn't write any SF for years. You know, he didn't for a long, long time. And he'd written his best SF novels, The Naked Sun and The Caves of Steel, in the 50s. And then he just became a popular science writer and wrote loads and loads of non-fiction books. You know, and Silverberg did the same in the early to mid 60s. So you can't blame these guys for wanting to do something different and have a better life, which they did. So that's Bester. If you haven't read him before, do watch out, I would say, particularly for this one. And the first two novels from his SF canon are the absolute masterworks that we know and love. Hope you enjoyed that. Bye for now.